Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Nextdoor NetAdmin. Last week, we continued with our with the start of our saga of working through Active Directory, and I showed you how to set up a domain, a brand new domain, a brand new forest, and now we've got a domain controller right here, and I'm going to start walking us through bit by bit the various parts of Active Directory. And yeah, I'm just going to jump right into it. If we look at the administrative tools, you can see there's several items for Active Directory. The most notable parts are domains and trusts, sites and services, and users and computers. There's a few other things that I do plan on showing. ADSI edit is one, group policy management is another. And yeah, that's basically everything that is Active Directory adjacent right now. But right now we only have domain services in there. We haven't even started looking at certificate services or federation or any of the other stuff. So yeah. Let's start though with something that's relatively easy and something that many administrators are going to probably spend a lot of time in. That's Active Directory users and computers. For obvious reasons, that's where most of your day-to-day administration is likely going to be. When you have sites and services set up, you don't really have to worry about doing anything with that on a regular basis. The same is true for domains and trusts. Normally, you don't have to dig into that. So today, I'm just going to go through Active Directory users and computers. And this is what it looks like right off the bat when you start out. You've got built-in computers, domain controllers, blah, 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 and users. I say blah, 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 blah because honestly, foreign security principles, I'm not going to touch on a heck of a lot. Managed service accounts is probably something that deserves an entire video all on its own. So I'm just going to leave that alone for now. You'll note that there's a different icon. I don't know how well you can see that in the actual video, but Domain Controllers has a different icon. And there's a reason for that. Domain Controllers is not something like the rest. You can see it here. Most of these are containers, but Domain Controllers is an organizational unit. What is that? What's the difference? Well, first of all, built-in. I need to talk a little bit about built-in because it's something that most people are not going to touch, but definitely has some interesting ramifications. I said earlier that from the perspective of the domain, to some extent, the domain controller is the domain. While Active Directory is running, and specifically, I mean when the Active Directory domain services service is running, that's this guy right here, as long as it's running and the domain controller is booted in normal mode, there is no local account. There's no local anything. It's just not there. To some extent. Interestingly enough, if you take a look in built-in, you've got a bunch of security groups. You've got things like Hyper-V administrators, remote management users, remote desktop users, account op. What is all of this? These are all the groups that you started out with in a regular server. There's a few things that are a little, bit different. Terminal server license servers, that's probably not a group in your local account. But from the perspective of the domain controller, things in built-in function effectively as just groups. And built-in, membership in built-in will be reflected on all domain controllers, and it will act as though it is a local machine group. I don't know how well I am explaining this, so I'll give you an example of what I mean. Under users, you can see that there are other groups like domain admins. Okay, well, what if I want somebody to be able to log on to a domain controller in order to do maintenance, but they really should not have access to administer the domain? Well, if you were just looking at users, you'd go domain admins. There's no local machine administrators group. But there is the local machine administrators group is administrators here under built-in. And when you look at the description, it says it has complete and unrestricted access to the computer/domain. Is that actually the case? Well, see, domain admins are a member of the administrators group, which means if you're a domain admin, you can act as an administrator on any of the domain controllers. That makes perfect sense. But if you look at domain admins, administrators is not a member of domain admins, which means you can absolutely be a member of the administrators group on a domain controller, and you won't necessarily have admin access to the domain in Active Directory. I know, kind of confusing. Also important to note, while I say that this is kind of like the local machine administrators group, because it's built in and it's in the domain, this local administrators group actually takes effect on all of the domain controllers, but not on any of the computers joined to the domain. Computers joined to the domain will, like we see here, have the domain admins group added to their local administrators group on each workstation, but built-in administrators will not be there because built-in is the local machine category. I realize it's terribly confusing, and it's not something I expect a lot of people to fiddle with, but it's interesting to know that that's there. But if we come back up here, okay, so built-in domain is kind of our catch-all for local machine type groups, even though they take effect for all of the domain controllers and basically nothing else. But what's the difference here with an organizational unit versus these containers? For the most part, you want to be using organizational units. But for legacy reasons, and again, remember that Active Directory started, or excuse me, domains started before they became Active Directory, and Active Directory itself was just in 2000. So in the NT4 world where domains started, you had containers that were set up as default targets for new computer objects, new users. Managed service accounts and foreign security principles, I think, came later. Certainly the managed service accounts did. But for, again, legacy purposes, these are containers, not organizational units. And only domain controllers is an organizational unit. When you're looking at things like group policies can only be linked against the domain or an organizational unit. This is one reason why we ideally want to have organizational units created, but you want to create them according to what makes sense for your company or your particular situation. Some will, well, I'll get to that in a minute. Another thing that's interesting to note is if we take a look at properties for this, okay, general managed by com plus, okay, fine. But there's a lot more here than meets the eye. If you go to the View menu and tick Advanced Features, suddenly there's a whole lot more things that you can see in Active Directory. Some of these are, there's an MSTPM information, okay, quota container, lost and found. There's a keys container. There's a program data container. Most of this is stuff you will not need to touch, but now that you have advanced features turned on, if you go back to properties, you can see there's more tabs that we can view. We have general and managed by, same as we did before. Com plus is the other thing we had before, but now we have an object. You can see there's a canonical name for the object. This is in domain layout. This is not LDAP layout. This is just how Windows will show it. You can see what class it is, when it was created, modified, and what update sequence numbers you have. You can adjust security, although you will very, very rarely want to adjust security on anything, let alone domain controllers. But the other thing that I wanted to point out was the attribute editor, because there's a lot of interesting things that you can see and modify here. One of them is the distinguished name. If we view this, this is what it looks like in LDAP form. You've got OU equals, comma, DC equals. I don't remember 100% what DC means. I think it means domain component or something similar to that. And you'll see as we create new objects that the actual object, a user or a computer, will have a CN equals, and that means canonical name. But then there's a lot of other attributes here that have instance types or specific MS. Anything that starts with MS is a Microsoft specific extension to the general schema. You've got a name, object class, postal address, postal code, post office box. All of these things are attributes that you can set on an object. You're not going to have it set on this particular organizational unit because there's no need to do so. But for some of these, you can edit them. And for others, like we saw with the distinguished name, it's just view. So that you can see them does not mean you can modify them, but you can certainly get a lot more information that is really in LDAP than you can get necessarily through the GUI. But like I said, you'll typically want to create your own organizational units. What might that look like? Well, here's something that it's a setup that I would often use. For computers, I would set up something like domain computers. See this tick box that says protect from accidental deletion? We'll come back to that in a minute. When we have domain computers, I might also go and make sure that I have an organizational unit for domain users. And I'm naming them with the domain prefix because we already have a computer's container. We already have a user's container that's there by default. So I'm prefacing these with domain to make it clear which ones I'm wanting to use. I will also probably end up with an organizational unit for domain groups, because there's lots of different groups that you can add in to domain group. Lots of different types of groups that you can add into a domain. Wow, I'm stumbling over my words today. All right, if I refresh this, I can see domain computers along with domain controllers, domain groups, and domain users. Cool. So under domain computers, I might have another organizational unit for servers. I might have one for desktops. I might have one for not just laptops, because nowadays we have laptops and tablets and other things. So why don't I just call this mobile devices? Okay, cool. This is not a necessity. You might find that it works out better in a single domain to have an OU for a geographical area, North America, with another one for Europe. You might want to say one is New York, one is Paris, one is San Francisco, and one is Berlin. There's a lot of different options and flexibility for how you want to set this up. If you have your top level organizational units being things that are geographically based, then you might have computers, users, and computers and users most specifically. Underneath that, groups are probably domain wide, and that's okay. Or if you have computers as your top level, you might break it down into servers, desktops, mobile devices, and that's probably good enough. If, particularly in a small to medium business, you only have a couple locations, you probably don't need to break it out by location. Same thing with users. Here you could have an OU for management, you could have an OU for sales, you could have an OU for anything you like. I'm just going to go with management. I'm going to go with sales because I said sales. And then I'm also going to have one for IT. And this is specifically for IT staff, essentially. All right, cool. What else? Domain groups? Well, domain groups, this is going to be very, very flexible. In small businesses, probably just a single domain groups is fine. If you are a more medium-sized business, or if you have a very complicated file system hierarchy, you might find it useful to have a group that controls access to a set of folders. And depending on how fine-grained your permissions need to be, you might have a lot of these groups. So you might end up with an organizational unit for file access groups versus group policy groups, security groups that you're using to filter group policy. You might have groups that are specifically for distribution lists if you happen to have Exchange integrated into your domain. You might have a separate organizational unit for mail-enabled security groups, or a specific OU for write back if you have it integrated into 365, so that any Teams groups in Microsoft Teams can be synchronized back to the domain. You might have a lot of different groups. And so the OUs are there to help you organize it and make sense of it in whatever way it makes sense to you, in whatever way it makes it easier for you to administer things. So I'm not going to go into the depths of how to set up OUs in domain groups because it's not something I'm going to focus on here. So if we go into sales, let's say I create a user here under domain users. Well, okay, so demo user, great. As you can see, it's just updating the full name to be whatever I type in for first name, last name, and an initial. And it'll add an actual dot to make it an initial. Interesting. But I'm not going to have an initial there. User login name. This is a user principal name. And I'm going to make it duser. First initial and last name. At whatever your domain name is on the domain. If I had nextdoornetadmin.local, this would be at nextdooradmin.local, nextdoornetadmin.local. It looks like an email address, and if you've used your actual domain in Active Directory, and if you have Exchange, then hey, presto, your user principal name does indeed become an email address. And if you're integrated with Office 365, it should be your email address, yes, but it doesn't have to be. If you've used .local, it'll just be a .local. If you have alternate UPNs, let's say you started with a .local and then you added the .ca or the .com as an alternate suffix for integration with 365, you could select the suffix that you want for the user principal name. Pre-Windows 2000, in the NT4 days, you had a NetBIOS form for this, which was the NetBIOS domain name / the username. And this format with the NetBIOS / and then the user is still very common. In some cases, some applications are still looking for this pre-Windows 2000 name, and sometimes it's shorter to type in, particularly if you have a long domain name. But either one of these should work. They refer to the same user. They're just alternate ways of identifying that user. Password is just something I'm going to type in just because. If you want, you can say the user must change password at next login. This is great if you're just going to give them an initial password and then you expect them to set their own. Cool. If you're setting up an account for a service and a user account that's going to be used to run a SQL server or a web server or something else that needs permissions within the domain, then you probably don't want that password to change. And you'll say user cannot change password and password never expires. Password never expires is an important one. Your group policies by default require users to change passwords every 42 days, and they cannot use any of the previous 24 passwords. That's ridiculous. Microsoft still has this as a default because it's a legacy default. But Microsoft's actual guidance now is disable password expiry. It used to be if an account was compromised, well, you don't necessarily know when that's going to happen, and so you want to change all of the passwords preventatively on a fairly frequent basis. But here's the thing, unfortunately, that leads people into going, oh, what's my password now? What's my password now? What am I going to do? And people start to get lazy because it's the only way that they can keep up with those passwords. They'll add a number on the end and then they'll just increment it by 1, or they'll say, oh, it's a pattern that I'm going to have to just go through the same thing. And when we rely on patterns, that makes it really easy for automated tools to crack. So the official guidance from Microsoft has changed. Don't expire the passwords by default at all. Let your users come up with a difficult password and let them invest in memorizing that one difficult password, because they're not going to be required to change it every 6 weeks or every 6 months. Let them just create something that's difficult and stick with it. If their account is not breached, then it's no problem. If they leave the company, you're not going to sit there leaving the account enabled, are you? No, you're going to disable it, and then it won't be usable anyway. If you have a hack, a breach of your network, number one, you're going to know about it, but number two, what's the next thing you're going to do? You're going to go and reset everybody's passwords for security. So if you're going to do that anyway, anytime you've been breached, then why make it an every so often regular thing that's actually going to hurt your password security? These are some of the things that you have to think about as an administrator, and you might need to spend quite a bit of effort convincing management on too. So, user cannot change password and password never expires. It's a good thing to have so that it doesn't immediately go crazy. every 6 weeks you have to go in and change the configuration for your service account. That's terrible. And I just usually, if I'm going to say it never expires, I'm also just going to say user cannot change password, just so that I know if it changes, it has to have been an admin who did it. Cool. But in this case, I'm going to say password never expires because, this is a demo thing and I don't have to worry about it. And that's about it. You can create an account in a disabled state if you're pre-creating the account. That can be useful for some things, very advanced cases where you're pre-deploying accounts. But for the most part, I'm not going to worry about that right now. And that's pretty much it. Now, if you're adding a user through Active Directory users and computers, you choose what OU it's in. That's cool. If you're joining a computer to the domain, there are ways, particularly if you're doing it through PowerShell or if you're doing it through an unattended script XML, that you can specify exactly what OU you want to create the new computer account in. But if you're going through just the default dialogues that says add it to the domain, type in an administrator password to verify it, it's going to create it by default under the computer's container because that's the default. But you can change that. And in fact, Microsoft has this wonderful little article about redirecting the users and computers containers. It's important to note that, this is essentially modifying the well-known objects attribute. And by default, okay, CN computers, CN users, that's where it's going to go. This affects the domain join user interface and then a bunch of command line tools, but most of these you're not going to be working with, but the domain join UI is important. Or it used to be. If you've scripted everything, kind of like I've started doing with the unattended setup, then this is less important, but it's still good to know about. It's also interesting to note that this requires your domain to be at least 2003 functional level. So this is very much a legacy concern, but the defaults are still to have these set up because that's what exists for legacy purposes. I'll skip to the bottom of this and say that essentially there's a Redirusr command that you can run to point it to a specific OU. More importantly, will be Redircmp. And I would use this to point it to OU equals domain computers, etc., etc. And to get that, I would just go to, okay, I want it to go into domain computers, properties. Here's my attribute editor. Here's my distinguished name. View, now I can copy it because I don't want to make any errors in how I type this out. I'm just going to copy it. And then I would run Redircmp and paste this in OU. And because it has a space in it, I'd have to surround it with quote marks as those things. So Redircmp quote OU equals domain space computers, blah, 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 blah. And then end quote. And now if I join a computer to the domain by using just the regular domain join user interface, it will go by default into domain computers. And then from there, I can move it to servers, desktops, mobile devices, whatever makes sense from there. And that way, because you can't apply group policies to the default computer's container, you can only apply it to the domain. If I apply it to the domain, then it means it covers everything, and that may not necessarily be what I want. If I can link group policies for computers just to domain computers and then redirect the default group to say, hey, any new incoming computers should go to domain computers, and then I'll sort them out after that. Perfect. All right. So that's a very brief tour through the most visible parts of Active Directory users and computers. There's still more to go through here. I haven't even touched on the domain functional level. I haven't even touched on the flexible single master, flexible service master objects, FSMOs, or operations masters, but they're FSMOs in short script. And that's all stuff that I'll have to talk about another time. Same as the, here's one more thing. Let's say I've created this and I want to get rid of it. Okay, yeah, sure, delete it. Oh wait, no, I can't delete it by accident. It's protected from accidental deletion. Because if you've put a bunch of accounts in an organizational unit and you try to delete it, then there's no real undo button. That's another thing in Active Directory. If you delete something, there is no undo. You can enable an Active Directory recycle bin if your domain's at the right functional level, but accessing it's a pain. So it's always better to disable rather than delete. And we'll cover that again in future as well. But if you really, really want to delete it, it's as simple as coming to the Object tab, which again only shows up if you have advanced features enabled. But then you can untick the box that says Protect from Accidental Deletion, OK it, then you'll be able to delete it. But right now I'm not going to do that. All right, that is more than enough for now, and there's still a lot more to go. There's actually a lot under Active Directory administration. So if you have thoughts on anything that we've talked about today, or if you have thoughts on things that you'd like to see me talk about as well, we don't have to do Active Directory until it's all the way finished. We can take detours along the way and look at other things too. So if you have anything that you want to share or that you want to suggest, feel free to let me know right down there in the comments section. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching. I am your next door NetAdmin, and we will see you next time.